Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting soft rays on the roof of the small hut where Tu Diep lay resting. She slowly opened her eyes, feeling lighter after a long night's sleep. Quietly, she began tidying up and lit the fire to prepare breakfast. She rinsed rice, filled the pot with water and placed it over the flames, patiently waiting for the porridge to cook. While waiting, she didn't sit idle. She picked up her knife and began slicing the bamboo stalks she had gathered the day before. Her hands moved quickly, skillfully splitting each one into thin strips to use for fixing the hut. The fire crackled gently, its warmth blending with the smoke rising into the morning air. As she worked, her thoughts drifted back to everything that had happened, from the day she was sold into Paul's family, to the pain and mistreatment she endured, and finally to James, who had stepped in and freed her. Life had changed so quickly, and part of her still struggled to believe she had truly escaped the shadows of her past. Tu Diep sat down in front of the pile of bamboo she had collected. The stalks were still damp with morning dew, their fresh scent mingling with the crisp air. She pulled a long piece toward her, gripping her knife tightly. She used her foot to hold the bamboo in place, then pressed the blade along the grain. The knife sliced through the tough outer layer with crisp, steady sounds. She adjusted the pressure carefully, one cut then another, until thin strips of bamboo began peeling away. The sun climbed higher, shining through the gaps in the leaves and casting light on her focused figure. Sweat rolled down her forehead, but she didn't stop. Her eyes stayed locked on her task, her hands moving swiftly and with precision. She knew that one careless cut could ruin the bamboo, making it useless for construction. Each finished strip was set aside and she moved on to the next stalk, bits of bamboo skins scattered across the ground. From time to time, she paused to run her hand along the strips, checking their thickness. If any were uneven, she patiently trimmed them until they met her standards. She refused to rush, even for the smallest detail. When she finally finished a batch, she gathered the strips into small bundles and tied them securely for future use. Stretching her back, she felt the dull ache in her shoulders, but paid it no mind. Looking at her work, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. James drove along the dirt road leading to a large corn farm, where he had an appointment to finalize a purchase agreement. When the car came to a stop, he stepped out and took a deep breath before walking toward the farm manager. His eyes were sharp, focused entirely on the task ahead. The meeting took place in a small wooden hut in the middle of the farm. The manager laid out the contract on the table and spoke clearly. "This is our biggest harvest of the year. If we partner with your company, we want assurances on pricing and market access." James scanned the contract, his eyes tracing the long list of figures and clauses. But he didn't sign immediately. He wanted to ensure the quality of the corn was up to standard, so he asked to inspect it himself. He walked through the rows of tall stalks, reached out and snapped an ear of corn from a plant. Peeling back the husk, he examined the plump golden kernels. He gave a small nod. "The quality is good," he said calmly. "The contract will be signed, but I need to be sure the supply can be sustained over the long term." The manager nodded confidently. James picked up the pen and signed the document with a firm, decisive stroke, just like the way he handled everything in life. Without lingering, he returned to his car and headed straight for the grapefruit farm, which had been facing production issues in recent months. From afar, he could already see the trees looking sparse and worn, the fruit fewer than in previous seasons. He stepped out of the vehicle, his face darkening as he saw workers collecting baskets of grapefruit that barely filled half of what was expected. He walked over to the manager. "What's going on here?" The manager let out a sigh and explained the situation. "The weather's been unpredictable and pest issues have made the trees weaker. Yields have dropped badly." James walked among the trees, observing the soil, the leaves, the fruit. After a moment, he turned back with a clear voice. "We need to change how we're taking care of these trees immediately. I'll provide additional funding to improve the soil and supply the right fertilizers, but everyone needs to step up their efforts." The manager nodded, promising to do everything he could to improve the situation. Before leaving, James paused to watch the workers continue harvesting. Only after a long moment did he get back in the car and drive away. He knew fixing the grapefruit farm would take time, but there was no room for delay if he wanted to keep his business strong. Tu Diep sat in front of the small hut, her hands moving quickly as she tied bamboo strips together to build a chicken coop. Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting golden rays across the little yard where she worked in silence. Sweat dotted her forehead, but she stayed focused, her eyes fixed on each movement. She wanted to build a stable life for herself. It might be simple, even humble, but it would be hers. No one could command or hurt her here. While she was hammering a wooden peg into the frame, the sound of footsteps approached from a distance. She looked up and saw James walking toward her, carrying a bundle of mosquito netting and some rope. She paused for a moment, slightly surprised, then lowered her gaze and returned to her task, not letting herself get distracted. James stopped in front of her, set the fabric down, and glanced around. "You're planning to do all of this on your own?" His voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern. Tu Diep nodded, continuing to secure the bamboo to the frame. "I can handle it." James watched her for a moment, then bent down and picked up a bamboo pole. "Then let me help." Before she could respond, he grabbed a tool and began hammering stakes into the ground. Tu Diep glanced at him, then said nothing more. She simply kept working. The two of them labored side by side in silence. The only sounds were the steady thudding of wooden mallets and the snapping of tightened rope against bamboo. As the chicken coop gradually took shape, James stood and brushed off his hands, turning to look at her. "How many chickens are you planning to raise?" Tu Diep paused, thinking for a moment before answering quietly. "I don't know yet. I just want to make something by myself." James looked at her for a long time, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. This girl, no matter how many times life knocked her down, still found the strength to rise. The work was nearly done when James received a call from his company. He glanced at the screen and frowned, then turned to her. "I have to go. Don't keep working alone. That's enough for today." Tu Diep watched him walk away, her chest tightening with a feeling she couldn't explain. She lowered her head and quietly continued the last bit of work, the breeze behind her rustling the trees gently. She didn't know what the future held, but at least for now, she wasn't alone. The next morning, James drove to Tu Diep's small hut as promised. He stepped out of the car, holding a small bag in his hand. Tu Diep was sweeping the yard when she saw him approach. She paused, a bit startled. She still wasn't used to this kind of care, but she couldn't bring herself to reject it either. James walked over, his voice calm, carrying a touch of gentleness. "Today I'm taking you to get some new clothes. You need something better to wear." Tu Diep lowered her head, a little flustered. She had never imagined stepping into a clothing store, much less having someone willingly buy clothes for her without expecting anything in return. Seeing her hesitate, James frowned slightly. "Come on, don't overthink it." In the end, Tu Diep quietly followed him. When they arrived at the clothing store, she felt like she had entered another world. Beautiful dresses and shirts hung neatly on the racks. The soft fabric brushed against her fingers as she reached out to touch it. James stood beside her, occasionally picking out an outfit and handing it to her. "This one would look good on you, try it." But Tu Diep gently shook her head, her eyes hesitant. "I'm not used to wearing things like this." James looked at her for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You deserve to wear something better." Eventually, with his quiet encouragement, she chose a simple outfit that fit her well. When she stepped out of the fitting room, she looked a little self-conscious, but James's expression held a faint sense of approval. "You looked beautiful." After the shopping, James took her to a small roadside cafe to rest. They chose a quiet corner and he ordered 2 drinks. He watched her silently. She still seemed reserved, but there was a slight ease in her expression that hadn't been there before. But not long after, a woman walked into the cafe. She was elegant, confident, and her eyes quickly locked onto James. When she noticed Tu Diep sitting with him, she approached, her tone edged with mockery. "James, I didn't expect to see you with someone like this." Tu Diep stiffened, her fingers tightening around the glass in front of her. The woman continued, her gaze sweeping over Tu Diep with disdain. "Do you really think she's a match for you? Or is this just pity disguised as kindness?" Tu Diep felt her chest tighten. She thought she had left that kind of humiliation behind with the Pao family, but here it was again, sharp and cutting. What she didn't see was the way James had been watching her. And now, his eyes turned cold. Tu Diep sat still on the chair, her hands gripping the hem of her shirt tightly. Her gaze was fixed on the table, unable to meet the eyes of the woman in front of her. Each sharp word felt like a blade cutting into her, making her feel more humiliated than ever. After leaving the cafe, she walked slowly, her steps heavy as if each one carried the weight of everything she was holding inside. She didn't know where she was going, only that she wanted to get away. From the cruel words, from the shame, from the pain. She kept walking until she found herself by a small river. The sun was setting, and its fading light shimmered on the water's surface. She sat down on an old wooden bench nearby, her vacant eyes watching the quiet flow of the river. A single tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but more followed, falling silently as the breeze grew colder, brushing against her skin. Then, a warm voice called out from behind. "How long are you planning to sit here and cry?" Startled, Tu Diep turned around. James was there, his eyes filled with worry. He didn't rush, he simply walked over and sat beside her, his gaze resting quietly on the river. She bit her lip and tried to wipe her tears again, but James gently reached for her hand, shaking his head. "Don't pretend to be strong when you're hurting." Tu Diep looked at him, her eyes red and swollen. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why you treat me so kindly." James sighed, then without warning pulled her into his arms. "Because I want to." Tu Diep froze, but the warmth of his embrace slowly eased the tension in her body. It was As night fell, James gently let go and said softly, "Let's go home." They walked back to the hut together. When they arrived, Tu Diep opened the door and placed the new clothes and items on the table. She took her time arranging everything, her eyes full of quiet gratitude. These were the first things in her life someone had given her without asking for anything in return. James stood watching her for a moment, then said, "I'll head back now, get some rest. Don't think too much." Tu Diep nodded slightly and walked him to the door. She stood there for a while, watching his figure disappear into the night. She didn't know what the future would bring. But tonight, for the first time in many years, she no longer felt alone.
Chú chó đang bẫy đuôi bên chân cô và mỉm cười yếu ớt. Haki, bạn đã đói chưa? Cô hỏi với giọng dịu nhẹ nhàng như nói với một người bạn thân thiết. Cô lấy chút thức ăn căn bếp nhỏ xuống, đặt xuống quan sát Haki. Ăn ngấu nghiến với đôi mắt long lanh nhìn chú chó, cô cảm thấy lòng nhẹ nhõm hơn một chút, nhưng nỗi dây dứt về giam vẫn không ngừng gõ cửa tâm hồn cô. Mình đã từ chối anh ấy, nhưng tại sao là mình đại đau như thế này? Cô tự hỏi, tay vô thức siết chặt mép áo rách như thể muốn bám víu một điều gì đó không thể chìm vào hố sâu cảm xúc. Cô thức dậy quyết định bắt đầu ngày mới bằng công việc quen thuộc, nấu ăn cho Haki, chăm sóc vườn. Khi ngọn lửa trong bếp nhỏ bùng lên, cô nhìn vào đó, tưởng tượng con mực giam hiện ra giữa những tia sáng nhảy múa. Cô nhớ đến giọng nói trầm ấm của anh, cách anh kiên nhẫn đến bên cô một ngày trong bóng tối, nhưng rồi cứ với lời từ chối hôm qua lại hiện về sắc nhọn như một